Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, I am going to be teaching you about the different types of stats on MapleStory, why they're important, why you don't want too much of them sometimes, and generally just everything that you need to know about different types of stats on this game. What is final damage? What is IAD? Why do you not want too much boss? Why is attack so important? What does crit damage do? All these different stats that are in MapleStory. There are so many different ones, and I'm going to be teaching you what they do, how you should interpret them, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a better understanding of where damage comes from on this game and why we go certain builds, certain pots, and get certain gear. There's going to be a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is damage on this game is very strange, I guess, because there are so many different stats and so many different little things that contribute to your total damage. Nexon tried to make this a little bit easier to understand with combat power. They tried to make a number that just represents how strong you are, but in reality, this number actually doesn't tell you exactly how strong you are, because there are certain things that contribute to your damage that are not factored into the combat power, like your Hexa stat, for example, and your Hexa matrix. For example, if I had level 30 origin skill or I had level 1 origin skill, it would make absolutely no difference to my combat power. So somebody who has level 30 origin and somebody who has level 1 origin and they have the same combat power, at face value, you might think they're the exact same strength, but no, the person who has higher Hexa is way stronger. Which leads me to my next point. There is no end-all be-all way to determine how strong somebody is on this game. That's like 100% foolproof. Now, I know a lot of people will bring up Hexa converted. What does Hexa converted mean? You'll see that term be thrown around in the end game. Hexa converted is essentially just similar to combat power, where it's a number that represents how strong you are, and it takes in your Hexa skills as a factor for that number. But at the end of the day, it also doesn't tell you exactly how strong you are, because different classes function differently and different bosses have different amounts of uptime. Players control their classes differently and are sometimes not as optimized as others. There are Ozring differences, all these different factors that can't tell you exactly how strong you are. Like, for example, in a game like Final Fantasy 14, you could see in this image here that's highlighted, there's a number that says 130 and an average item level 130. I know it looks a little confusing, but my point is, in different MMOs, if you're not a MapleStory player and you're coming to this game, there's a number in other MMOs that tell you exactly how strong you are. And if somebody else has a higher number than that one, then they are stronger than you. But that's not how it works in MapleStory. For example, I'm at 239 mil combat power, but somebody at 230 mil combat power could be stronger than me because they could be playing a different class, they could have better Hexa, and they could be stronger than me. So you cannot really use combat power as a way to gauge exactly how strong somebody is. And that goes the same with how much stat you have, your damage range, Hexa converted. These are all tools, but they don't exactly tell you how strong somebody is. Now, obviously, if there's a big gap, like if somebody's 239 mil CP and somebody's 20 mil CP, the guy at 239 mil CP is way stronger. Like, that's just a fact. But when the numbers are close, you can't exactly tell. Now, the next thing that I want to go over is certain key stats and what they mean. So the top part of your stats tab is basically just what people refer to as your stat. Since I'm a hero and I'm a warrior, I primarily use the strength stat. And if you hover over it, it tells you where you're getting all of your strength from all these different sources. Base value, value percent, that's like from my pots on my gear. Like, for example, this has 12, 12, 9, so 33% gets added onto the base. You get it from skills, your equips base stats, your legion, all this stuff. Like, you get a lot of different stat from a lot of different sources, and it gives you strength. And this is like the number that you want to always increase, and the more that it increases, the stronger you get, generally. Now, that might seem to be the case, like, oh, I want to just keep getting more stat and I'll get stronger. And technically, you could roll strength on your weapon or your secondary or your emblem. Why would you not want more strength? Because there are other things that contribute contribute to your damage other than just stat. Stat is just one thing that contributes to your damage, but there are a lot of things that contribute to your total damage output on MapleStory. So let's talk about damage range next. So people always say, what's your range? What's your range? So damage range, there are a couple different ways to look at it. The first way that you should look at it is you should never compare damage range between other classes. So as a Hayato, the only other people's range that I should look at is other Hayatos, because different classes scale differently with their weapons, with their range, their passives, all that stuff. In general, to be honest with you, you shouldn't really compare stats to other people, just in general. That's just a very good advice that I could give you on this game, is you shouldn't compare stats to other people, because different classes scale very differently, especially early game. I see this all the time where people say, why is this guy clearing this boss faster than me? I have more stat than him. My range is higher than him. Why is he clearing the boss faster than me? There's a million different factors, so you shouldn't compare. So your damage range, there's the regular damage range, and then there's your normal enemy damage range for mobs, and then there's your bossing damage range you can see at the bottom. So your damage range is calculated based off of what type of weapon you have and how much weapon mastery you have. Weapon mastery, all it means is the variance in which your lines will hit. So I know that sounds a little bit weird, but I'll show you. So if I hit a monster, you're going to notice that it's not the exact same amount of damage per line. Like these are like 4.9, 4.7 when I use my basic attack, 4.5. It's not the exact same damage. I'm not doing exactly like 5 bill per line every single time. And that's because there's a damage range. This number has a range of which it can be applied to your damage. And your weapon mastery makes it more consistent. So if I had like a 90% weapon mastery, for example, that means the range of hits would have like a plus or minus 10% range. So it'd be pretty inconsistent. Sometimes you would high roll a hit and have like a really big hit, and then sometimes you would low roll. But if it's 99%, then it's only like plus or minus like 1% each hit. So it's very consistent. Usually classes have very high mastery. It's not something you really want to worry about, but figured I would talk about it. The next thing is your boss damage range and your normal enemy range. You notice that they're different. They're different numbers. It's not the exact same. And that's because your boss damage is a different stat that gives you more damage specifically against the boss targets. So there are normal targets and boss targets on this game. And boss damage, it doesn't help you with mobbing, but it only helps you with regular bossing. So because I have a bunch of boss damage, it makes it so that my bossing range is much higher, specifically for bossing. And then normal enemy, it's a little bit higher because I have passives or other link skills that make you do damage specifically on mobs. So that's why that range is a little bit higher. So the range kind of just gives you a number that sort of tells you how much bonus damage you're doing on regular monsters and boss type monsters. But it's really not that important. Like your range doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. But I figured I would explain it. Damage percent. So what damage percent is on this game is it gives you bonus damage on just hitting things in general. So whatever you hit, you're doing this amount % more damage on top of your base damage. So this applies to normal monsters and boss monsters. Now, boss damage is the same as regular damage, except it only works on boss monsters. So getting more boss damage just makes you do more damage on bosses. So this part of the video is just explaining what the stats do, but then later we'll talk about why you aim for certain amounts of boss damage, why you want certain amounts of ID, how you get it, all that stuff. Final damage. Now, final damage is a very interesting thing on this game because in my opinion, it makes the game pretty like broken, because the way this thing scales and the way it works is very strange. So final damage, the way that you could think about it is it's a multiplier that gets applied to your damage at the end of the calculation. So when you hit something, a calculation is done in the game to determine how much damage you do. So if I hit a monster and I do 5 billion damage on it, the final damage calculation part of that 5 billion gets applied at the end because it's a multiplier to everything else, to how much damage I'm doing that's contributed from my strength, my damage, my boss damage, my attack power. All that stuff gets added up into a number, and then final damage is the multiplier at the end. So let's say I do 100 damage and then I gain 10% final damage, right? So what you would do is you would multiply that 100 times 1.1, and now you are doing 110 damage. So final damage directly increases your total damage output multiplicatively. So it's very, very strong. The more final damage you have, the more damage you are doing outright, like straight up. Whereas this number, the 100, is like an amalgamation of a bunch of different things, of boss damage, stat, attack. Like this number is a combination of a bunch of stuff, but the final damage is a multiplier at the end that gets applied and tells you how much more damage you're going to do. So if I gain an extra like 10% boss damage, for example, that doesn't mean that this number is going to go up by 10%. That's not how that works. It just means that the boss damage part of this calculation is 10% higher, which means that this number might go up a little bit, but it's not going to go up exactly 10% like how final damage does it. Final damage is the only thing in the game that goes up literally the exact amount of percentage that it says. So for example, if I press weapon aura here, this skill gives me 6% final damage. So you would think that this number would go up by 6%. It would go to 65.5, but no, it actually goes to 69.07. The reason why it goes to 69.07 is because final damage scales multiplicatively from different sources. So what does that mean? So we started at 59.5% final damage and we gained 6% final damage from weapon aura. So you would think that the 59.5% plus 6% would give you 65.5%. No, that's not how it works. Because final damage sources from individual sources are multiplicative, you have to write each number as a decimal and then multiply them. And that's how we got 69.07% final damage. And if we would have used another skill like Princess Akuna's Blessing or something, we would have gotten even more final damage that scaled even more multiplicatively. Let's say you have a final damage source that gives you incrementally more final damage as the buff continues, like Hydo's Phantom Blade, for example. Every time I use it, I get bonus 23% final damage. Since the final damage source is coming from the same skill, it is not multiplicative, it's actually additive. So it becomes 23 plus another 23, which is 46, and so on. So this is a very interesting stat that works very weird, but it's very, very OP. Now, ignore defense. This is something that people talk about all the time. This is IED. This is what people refer to as. And what does IED do? So IED helps you shred through a boss's armor. So every single boss in the game has a certain amount of defense or armor or PDR. There's different terms for it, but it's all the same thing. Defense, armor, PDR, they're all the same. And IED helps you bypass that armor. So for example, let's just round down and say I'm at 97% IED. A lot of bosses on MapleStory have 300 PDR, which is the same as 300 defense, right? Since I'm at 97% IED, you would do 300 times 0.97 because that's how much IED I have. And then you get 291. So that tells you how much defense is being shredded off of the boss. So instead of the boss having 300 PDR, because I have 90% IED, it's as if the boss has 9% PDR, and that's how much damage reduction I have only. So that means I would be doing 91% of my total damage output on the boss because I have 97 IED. So you can see that IED is very important because it makes you do more damage. You could think of it like armor piercing or lethality in like other games, like stuff like that. You would be doing more damage on a target that has defense because you have IED. So it's very important to have. So normal enemy damage is the same as boss damage, but it only specifically works for normal monsters. So it helps you mob better. And you can get this from, you know, your hyper stats or whatever, Lara Link skill. Attack power. So attack power you get from your star forcing, you get from your attack percent on your weapon secondary emblem, and then magic attack as well. They're both the same. And some classes use attack, some classes use magic attack. Mages in this game all use magic attack, and then everybody else uses regular attack. And attack is just another piece of the puzzle that contributes to your total damage output. And attack is really good because it is a bigger part of the pie that contributes to your total damage output than, for example, stat. So if there was a way to get attack, it's usually better than getting stat, but it just depends. Like there's ratios that it gets a little bit more complicated, but attack is really good and it makes you a lot stronger. Crit rate, so critical rate, there's a chance to crit in this game, and every class at the end of the day gets 100% crit rate, so it's not something to really worry about, but there's a chance to crit. There's non-crits and regular crits, and crits just make you do bonus damage whenever you hit. So it's very important to crit because critting gives you a tremendous amount of damage. For somebody who doesn't crit versus who crits, it's like a huge damage difference. And then critical damage increases the amount of damage that your crits do, so it's also very strong. Critical damage is close to final damage in the way that it scales. Final damage, like I said, is the only thing that truly multiplicatively increases your damage output, but critical damage is pretty close. It really increases your damage output a lot because it directly makes all of your crits, and because you're critting all the time, hit way harder. Cooldown reduction, so cooldown reduction literally just makes your cooldowns less, but cooldown reduction only works in weird ways. So for example, if you have a cooldown hat like this one that says skill cooldown -2, there's a limit. You can see it says 10% for under 10 seconds, minimum cooldown at 5 seconds. So for example, a skill like this, Falcon's Honor, that has an 8-second cooldown, it's not going to literally be reduced by 4 seconds and it's going to go to a 4-second cooldown because it gets diminished the more and more that you have for low cooldowns. But something like this skill, Batajutsu Zanko, that has a 90-second cooldown, it would literally go down by 4 seconds because it has a big cooldown. And then the 5% is from something like Mercedes Legion Block that gives a % decrease. Buff duration, so buff duration is a stat that increases the amount of duration that your buffs have. And buff duration only works on skills that are 4th job and below. It doesn't increase the duration of 5th job skills, 6th job skills, hyper skills. So for example, this skill, Terms and Conditions, it has a 10-second duration, but since I have 97% buff duration, it's going to last 97% longer. So if I press it, you're going to see it went to 19 seconds, which is the regular 10 seconds, and then 97% more of that would be 19.7 seconds long. That's how long the skill lasts. Cooldown not applied is cooldown skip. So you can get cooldown skip from your Legion artifact or your inner ability, and it gives you a chance to skip the cooldown entirely of an ability. But cooldown skip doesn't work for skills that are hyper skills, 5th job skills, or Hexa skills. It's only 4th job skills and below, and only certain 4th job skills. It doesn't even skip every single skill, for example. Ignore elemental resistance. Now, ignore elemental resistance is a very interesting stat because it works kind of like final damage. So certain bosses have elemental resistance as well. There's like defense, like we talked about earlier with PDR, and then there's elemental resistance as well. But elemental resistance, this 5% that I'm gaining, it makes it go down by 5%, their total elemental resistance. So I'm basically doing 5% more final damage to the target. Additional status damage. So if the boss is debuffed, you'll also be doing more damage % to it. It works the exact same as damage %. You're just doing a little bit more damage. Summon duration increase. This makes your summons last longer, but not 5th job summons, only 4th job summons and below. So now that we have a general understanding of what the stats do, I gave like a pretty basic understanding of what they do. Now let's talk about why you want certain amounts of some stats and why your gear is set up in this way in the first place. So the first thing I want to talk about is IED. Why we want certain amounts of IED. How much IED do you need? Why is it so important? How do you get it? All that stuff. So IED, if you remember what we were talking about earlier, you might think that like, oh, getting 100% IED would be really good because that way I would be able to shred through all of the boss's armor, all of the PDR, and I would be doing a lot more damage. And that's true. You would be doing a lot more damage if you had 100 IED, but getting to 100 IED would mean that you have to sacrifice a lot of other resources. You have to sacrifice a lot of other stats to get there because there are only so many sources in the game that give you IED. So for example, on your weapon, secondary, and emblem, you can roll IED. Like for example, I have this other emblem that has an IED line on it. And if I put it on, I go to 97.9 IED, right? But I had to lose 10% attack, which is a massive amount, right? The difference in IED is only like 0.9%, but I lost like 300 attack, right? You can see the difference, which is a lot. I lost like 300 attack. So total, my damage output would actually go down, even though I'm gaining more damage from my IED part of the calculation. I lost a lot of damage from the attack part of the calculation. So on certain bosses, I would actually be losing damage. So that's why people say like, oh, you want as many attack lines as possible on your weapon, secondary, and emblem, because attack, on the other hand, doesn't have as many sources as IED. IED, you could get it from a lot of different sources. You could get it from your hyper stats. You get a lot of it from your Legion board. You get it from your Legion blocks. You get it from your armor base stats, like my pants have 5%, top has 5%, hat has 15%, my weapon has 20% IED on it. You get it from your set effects. The set effects have IED. You get it from your metal. There are so many different sources of IED in the game, so it's unnecessary to get it on your weapon, secondary, and emblem. Now, here's the thing, though. When you're very early into the game, you're not going to have all of this gear. You're not going to have all of these set effects because the gear takes a long time to get. So sometimes when you're early game, it could actually be very beneficial to get an emblem, for example, with IED on it because you don't have those other sources that give IED. But as you get deeper into the game and you get more sources of IED, it becomes inefficient to have it on your weapon, secondary, and emblem because now you want to optimize for your attack percentage, because how are you going to get attack percentage? You really can't get it from almost anywhere else other than your weapon, secondary, and emblem. Now, when it comes to boss damage is similar to attack in which there are only so many sources that you could get boss damage from. You get a lot of boss damage from your Legion blocks, from your inner ability, from your set effects, all that stuff. But you can also roll boss damage on your weapon and secondary. You can't roll it on your emblem. So sometimes it could be okay to get a little bit of boss on it, especially your secondary. If we look at our weapon, for example, 13, 10 attack, and 30 boss, right? So I am losing out on a potential extra line of attack for 30 boss. So I'm cutting out 10% of attack for 30 boss, right? But on my secondary, I have 12, 9, 30 attack. I'm cutting out 9% attack for 30 boss. So these are giving me the same amount of boss on my potential, but my secondary is cutting out a potential 9% line versus my weapon, which is cutting out a 10% line. So in the future, I would want to reroll my weapon because 10% attack is probably more worth than the 30 boss. But on the secondary, since it's only 9% attack, it's not as bad to have a boss line on your secondary. But long term, I probably still will roll off the boss damage from more attack, because boss damage, something that's very important to know in this game, is you always usually get more boss damage as the game progresses. So for example, there was a time period where the Eternal set wasn't in the game, but then the Eternal set was added to the game, and the set effects on the right side of the screen give you a lot of boss damage. And then same with the pitch boss set. As I unlock more of the pitch boss set, I'll get even more boss damage. So you can see that there are boss damage sources that I still don't have yet. And as I get more and more of it, it makes it so that I don't need it as much on my weapon and secondary, and I could start optimizing more for attack. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I'm rambling a lot, but hopefully that makes sense. Now, a big thing that I want to really hammer home is there aren't generally like, I don't usually like recommending people like certain amounts of boss damage or certain amounts of IED you should get. Like, for example, I'm at 97% IED. That doesn't mean that you should aim to get 97% IED, because different parts of the game require different things. And then I'm at 381% boss damage right now without any buffs. That doesn't mean that you need to get 381% boss damage without any buffs. Different stages of the game require different amounts of stats, and classes scale differently. So for example, a class like Shadower doesn't need as much IED as a class like Haro, because Shadower has built-in IED on its skills. So for example, if we look at Sonic Blow here, it says ignore defense 100%. If we look at Trick Blade, it says ignoring 100% additional defense. If we look at Slash Shadow Formation, SSF, it says additional defense ignored 100%. So certain classes have built-in IED on their skills, so they won't need as much IED. They don't need to prioritize it as early as other classes. But that doesn't mean you skip out on the IED resources. So generally, for most people, when you're approaching the mid to late game and you start getting your gear, as long as you obtain all of the free IED resources, you'll be fine. So what does that mean, free IED resources? So what that means is you're not losing out on something else to gain the IED. So for example, your Legion board, you have this entire section for IED. I'm not sacrificing anything else to get this IED. If I were to put these blocks elsewhere, what would they really give me? Maybe more buff duration, crit rate, I don't need it. Normal damage, I don't need it for bossing. Dex, MP, all this stuff, I don't need this stuff for normal bossing. So I'm not losing anything for having it here. But what I mean is, let's say on my emblem, I have a line of IED here, right? That could be a line of attack instead. So I'm sacrificing attack to get the IED. So when you're approaching mid, late endgame, you're not going to need these IED resources that sacrifice potential attack, because your set effects, your hyper stats, your Legion, your links, your built-in class ID, that'll be enough to cover for all the bosses. So you're not going to need all the extra stuff from your weapon secondary and emblem potentially. But early game, like this character is only level 220. Obviously, it doesn't have all the gear that gives me the IED, right? It's pretty good to have an IED line because I don't have all of those sources available to me yet. Now, back to boss damage here for a second. It's the same thing with boss damage. As long as you have all of the sources of boss damage that aren't costing you anything, they're not costing you attack, you'll be fine on boss damage as well. So like your gear set effects give you boss damage. Your Legion gives you boss damage, your inner ability gives you boss damage, your hyper stats, your link skills, all of these things give you a bunch of boss damage. So it's probably unnecessary long term to get even more boss damage. But the reason why there's a big but here is because different classes have different amounts of boss damage and different amounts of attack. For example, a class like Wild Hunter and a class like Kaiser have a lot of bonus attack percent built into their classes. So having boss damage is really good because they don't need as much attack percent because their class already provides it. But for most classes, having a bunch of attack lines across your weapon, secondary, and emblem in the end game is usually optimal. But as you're progressing through the game, having boss damage lines early could be really, really beneficial because you don't have all the set effects and all the gear that gives you the boss damage that you need. That's why I don't like giving somebody like end-all be-all advice. Like if somebody comes to me that's early game and they're like, how do I get stronger? And I just tell them, just get 3-line attack on your weapon secondary emblem. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. Not only is that super expensive, they also don't have all of the boss damage that they could be getting from other resources. So it's okay to settle boss until they get stronger. So it's very important to really consider where you're at in the game. And it's really hard to know this as a new player because there's just so much information that isn't handed to you and you're not going to know about it. Now let's talk about crit damage real quick. Crit damage, the only real sources for it are like your Legion and your gloves. So gloves are special in this game because they could roll crit damage. Since crit damage is a bigger piece to the pie that contributes to your total damage output, instead of rolling stat lines on it, you actually get crit damage on your gloves. And it's a really, really good way of increasing your crit damage, and it makes you way, way, way stronger. Honestly, I feel like that's like the main things that people don't quite understand. I probably could have explained things a little bit better, but hopefully if you're at this point in the video, you understand stats a little bit better on this game. I know it's a long video, a lot of yapping. It might be a little hard to follow, but long story short, the main things that I want you to take away from this video is to A, don't compare yourself to other people. Different classes scale differently. And B, you will get stronger over time without you even really having to do anything. Like, just as you do more dailies and as you clear more bosses and you get more gear, you're gonna get a lot stronger just because of like set effects and passive stats that you're gonna get. C, early game, it's okay to roll for IED lines and stuff like that because you don't have all the gear that you need. If you have any questions, leave a comment. If you got to this part of the video, what's the word that I want you guys to say in the comment so I know that you watched the whole thing? I want you to say FD. I want you to say FD, like the capital letter F and then the capital letter D. I want you to say FD, and then I'll know that you watched the whole thing. So shout out to y'all who say FD. If you have any questions, obviously leave a comment and I'll get back to you. If you want to consider helping me out, maybe subscribe, like the video, share it, come to my Twitch channel where we have a lot of fun and we play MapleStory every single day. With that all being said though, have a wonderful day. Shout out to my members, Blazefire, Shooms, Shagad, Ravi Espa, Koga, Piconir, Jesse B, Dante Victory, CK, Prelman, J, and Blunt Poppy Supreme Oil Backwards. I appreciate you guys so much and have a great day.